I'm pretty sure we'll explore all possible dimensions of resilience here. So may I ask the farm systems group? I see Roberto here. Roberto, are you reporting back from that session? Then
John is coming. I joined a little bit late, so he will report back. So he's coming soon.
So we are waiting for John. I think we should take that order actually. So bear with us for a couple of moments.
I want to ask just briefly while we're waiting. So did some of the groups have breakout sessions within breakout sessions? And how did that work? Marco is nodding his head. So you then did further breakouts?
Yeah, we had around 30 people, I think. So we had 2 breakouts within that. So, and Pauline and I were in one each. I think it worked okay. Oh, Pauline, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bit more space for everyone to say what they think, and it went well. We lost a few people, but hopefully they're back now in the plenary session.
Wonderful, great.
So we didn't have breakouts in the value chain session.
You did all a big one.
Yep.
And Roberto, did you do further breakouts in farming systems, or were you all together?
No, we did all together. We had the panelists system.
I see, you went to the panel.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Very good. All right.
Okay, so we just saw in the chat that John was taking the wrong link, like the normal link, I guess, and I'm not sure. I hope he'll come into the, how do we call that? The executive link, or what in this webinar function?
Yeah, he needs to be a presenter, and right now he's an attendee.
Yeah, he's back.
Oh, and there he is.
All right. Hey, John.
Okay. Sorry, I used the wrong link.
No worries.
No, it's all fine. So, John, we wanted to start the report back from the breakouts, and Roberto said that you were going to report on the farm systems session. So I suggest something like 5 minutes or so that we have a little chance after the 3 report backs to have a bit of a general discussion, okay?
Okay, okay. I will try. And we did have a rapporteur who maybe has some slides that she can put up, I'm not sure. But in the meantime, I'll just go ahead. Well, the approach we took was to have a panel that presented from several different perspectives, sort of ranged from biophysical to economic, on different aspects of how we can incorporate shocks and resilience. Sorry, my voice is going, and I don't have a glass of water here. How we can incorporate shocks and model resilience in farm systems. Heidi Weber and Sue Walker and Geeta Lakshmi talked from the biophysical side. Here we go. Great. Thank you for putting that up. Let's see, I don't think I can control that. So whoever's in control will have to.
Yeah, sorry, that's
there we go. So we had Sue, Heidi and Sue and Geeta really talking more from the biophysical side. Heidi talking about some of the work that they're doing to look at crop failures, and Sue addressed some issues related to climate and water availability. And Geeta then talked about some of the, used India as an example to talk about extremes and some of the limitations they've found to using models. This was also Heidi and part of Heidi and Sue's discussion as well about some of the limitations they've found in using the existing models to look at different aspects of shocks to primarily in their context of crop productivity. Then we really had three other panelists, Mark Corbeils and Phil Alderman and Roberto Valdivia, who really touched on aspects more from the economic side, I would say, or the whole farm system side. Mark did us a nice service. He actually looked at, sort of did a mini literature review, which, by the way, complemented what we did on Monday. We sent out to people who registered for our session a Google form inviting them to submit any studies they knew of that looked at shocks and resilience in farming systems. And interestingly enough, we got a pretty small number of responses, but it was about the same number that Mark found in his review. Some overlap there and some difference. But I think what it illustrates is that what we've found is that, at least in terms of studies that explicitly talk about shocks and resilience, a relatively small number of studies. I think point Mark made, and I would agree, is that there's probably a much larger group that in some respect talk about something like, you know, production risk and things like that in agriculture. We know there's been many of those kinds of studies, but really in terms of more explicitly looking at shocks and resilience of farming systems, a pretty small literature at this point. And Mark also pointed out that a recent review, pretty comprehensive review of models, found that really those models don't do a good job of representing some of the elements that are important to modeling shocks and resilience. And I think that really harkens back to the session we had yesterday morning, where the comment was made, I think, by several of the participants that if we really want to model shocks and resilience, it's really raising a different set of questions that many of our models were not really designed to address very effectively. And so it does really make this point that we're going to have to, we're going to need some innovation in the way we do the models and the kinds of data we have. And that really came out in these presentations also by Phil and Roberto, in how it, you know, it relates to, Alderman was talking about some of the linkages between shocks to production systems and rural communities, and some of the feedbacks that can be involved. And then Roberto talked about, you know, the work we've been doing on pathways and scenarios, and how we really have not so far incorporated shocks into that whole scenario or pathway concept, but we could, and resilience would come in how, you know, we might, you know, be, you know, pushed off of those pathways that we think we might be on from now into the future, and how resilience would relate to how well we would potentially return back to sort of an original trajectory or not. And so maybe to conclude just briefly, I think what we saw in this discussion was that we have a lot of tools and pieces of this pretty complex puzzle, but so far we you know, there's a big need to really think more carefully about how we bring these different pieces together, both on the biophysical modeling side and the economic and other sort of social science modeling, to, you know, at different scales. You know, here we were focused primarily on the farming system and how that kind of connects to the regional economies, but it also feeds up ultimately to the global as well. And maybe I'll just finish with one last point. I think it's also important to keep in mind, you know, a lot of our discussion and like our AgMIP work has been focused on systems in Africa and South Asia, smallholder type systems, but this is also a very important issue for large-scale commercial systems that really produce a lot of the food that goes into the commodity markets of the global food system. And really there is a whole host of different issues at that large commercial scale and different concepts of vulnerability. For example, perhaps more financial vulnerability than physical vulnerability and say in semi-subsistence systems, smallholder systems that we see in other parts of the world. So let me finish there. Hope I didn't use up too much time.
Yes, thank you, John. And I just want to mention there's already a question by Daniel Walk in the Q&A to think about for the later discussion. So insurance companies have a lot of data on shocks and their costs. Maybe it's worthwhile working with them. Maybe we can come back to that later. Who's going to report back on the value chain markets and trade session? Is it Carolyn or David or Sabine?
I can report, but I can have Caroline doing it. I don't see Sabine among the panelists. Okay. So I'm not sure if Caroline wants to do it, but otherwise I'm ready.
Yeah, Daniel, go ahead. It's fine.
Thanks a lot. So in our session, we had about 35 participants. So I gave a presentation and collect some feedbacks. And clearly, the first thing that we all agree on is, in the best case, we do an average job at capturing some of the shocks. But most of the models doesn't look at shocks or try to do the minimal services on it. But no one was very, I would say, satisfied or say that it's a topic that we control. What we have also noticed is, following the presentation of Mark Howden, and when we were discussing, what do we understand in terms of shock or in terms of resilience, there are some clearly differences, especially if we think about resilience as a system as a whole, or if we would like that each individual or each elements of the system itself is resilient. So for instance, we were using the example of, after a shock, if we go back to normal in terms of production, consumption, but there is more concentration of farms, concentration of companies, do we say that the system is resilient or not? And we had some polls, and basically half of the community saying, yes, if we are overall back to normal at the system level, the system is resilient, when half of the participants to the poll were saying, no, if there is some people that disappear in the process, we cannot say that the system is resilient. And it really leads the discussion to know about at which level we, with the different models we have, we are capturing these shocks, we are tracking these shocks, and behind it, we start to introduce the notion of risk and what is the idiosyncratic risk versus systemic risk, and all the discussion about, we say, variance, covariance, or that. If from the shock analysis, we want to move really to a more risk management analysis in terms of option. But maybe the most, and we discuss also how we can categorize the different type of shock that affect value chain in food system, both from the environmental point of view, the social point of view, and the economic point of view. But I think what's very important and pointed by different participants is the question of scale. On one hand, what is the time scale of the model? What is the time scale of the shocks? And can we move through this different time scale? And should we, because some people may be very interested in price volatility, but some aspect of price volatility on the short term has relatively limited impact on the long run. And if AgMIP want to be more on the medium long run, we may not need to prioritize that aspect. But also the spatial scale, and how some of the, in some case, even thinking at the national level is not enough. We need to think about the sub-national level. And of course, when we think about value chain, market, and trade, is how these different markets are interconnected, both in terms of product good, but also in some case, in terms of labor market. And that leads to potentially the last point I want to emphasize is, of course, in AgMIP, we talk a lot about the producers, but we should not forget the consumer, both through the food security angle, and not only thinking about the quantity of food, but also the quality of food, but more generally, what are the coping strategy of a household vis-a-vis of income and price shock, but also a change regarding their health status, their nutrition status, and their perception of some of these aspects. We discuss a bit regarding data. We clearly also make the point that there is a lot of things that is important when we model shocks, but there's also a lot of things that we don't know well to model even without shock. You know, complexity of the value chain, or some behavior like advertising. So when we focus, and maybe the way forward to look at this shock narrative and shock discussion is how we want to organize the thinking, because on one hand, we may be interested to look at one or two types of shock and see how they impact the different nodes of the value chain. And when we put the different value chain together, I would say how the system itself is impacted. Or we are talking about one value chain or one subset of a value chain, and we are looking about how the different nodes, of the different type of risk, type of shocks are impacting it. Because let's say that a flood event, of course, has an impact on the field, but it's an impact on the logistics, and so the transportation, and so on. So that, I hope to have captured most of the elements we discussed. And I thank all the participants to the session, to having it. But I really think that this question of moving in the time scale, both between short run and long run, and different spatial scale is one aspect where combining the different tools of AgMIP, but also looking about people that are not in AgMIP right now, can be quite useful, especially if we want to look at the value chain perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'd like to ask Sabine, you want to add anything from your perspective on this session?
Perhaps a little point. There was a notion beyond the complexity of what we can actually model to also think about what the different type of stakeholders actually need to be modeled, to be able to decide and act. And there was a summary of Carolina, as far as I understood, which I thought was quite useful also to, so how can we actually look from a bigger scale and say, do we want to return back to where we come from, or in how far can we use what the stakeholders need and what we can do to really reconfigure the system. And of course, for value chain modeling, this is most complex. So really the challenge to us, where do we enter, where can we start? Beyond, and also the other perspective, on how do then the shocks impact differently on different households and people, depending on context and food systems. So we brainstormed a number of value chain, food chains, to say at what level are they being traded, these different types of food, and how they are being impacted. So I guess for myself, for an environment where we are dealing with high vulnerability of households not being able to feed themselves, shocks like COVID-19, we need to prioritize the target group for which we then want to simulate the impacts of shocks on food systems. I think Caroline can add.
Okay, good. Thanks very much. I think we need to move on with the third breakout group. I wonder in between, so either, I don't know, Marco or Pauline, or who is going to give the report back. And I was wondering, maybe to Cynthia and the team, is there any way to kind of make those notes and summaries available, to the participants? But maybe you can answer that at the end of the session. So Marco and Pauline, please.
Sure, thanks. Pauline?
You haven't really coordinated. You go ahead, I'll follow you.
Okay, I'll put just a small summary together here. Let's see if that works. Do you see this screen?
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, okay. good. So we talked about a couple of different shocks in the breakout session. In our sub-breakout session, we had a lot of discussion on COVID, talk about the Locust plague, also flooding, and in the we had two presentations by Pauline and me to introduce the topic, and there we talked about trade and climate change as well. With respect to, so there is no shortage of things that are interesting, I suppose, for when it comes to shocks. Then it got much murkier when we talked about what approaches, right? So we highlighted over and over again that there's scales and what focus is important, similar to what seems to have come out of the previous work group, and that pertains to regional focus, global versus country versus sub-regional, but also time-wise. What impact parameter you can look at? Are you looking at mortality? Are you looking at other food security indicators? And then also, how do you represent the shocks? Do you go for a detailed representation that tries to really be fairly realistic in that sense, or do you go for general shocks? So there we had examples, heard about examples of generally representing supply shocks that would mimic, for example, COVID or the Locust plague. Or how do you present flooding and flooding impacts on health? And immediately when talking about that, we got into both data issues, but also issues that at the moment stand a little bit in the way of doing more detailed work. For example, with flooding, what is the direct link between flooding and food security? How can we even parameterize that in if we don't have good data on all of those aspects, or if we don't know where to look at or what aspect to look at? Similar with COVID, do we treat it like a normal supply shock, or do we need to parameterize it in different ways? What about the socioeconomic characteristics with subgroups of the population, which seem to be very important with COVID? And I think, Pauline, what came from your subgroup was a bit also this call for having sort of a model arsenal almost ready when such shocks occur, so something can be said in a faster and more timely fashion about that shock, but maybe also about vulnerabilities that shock produces. We talked a little bit about data as well, and I guess a common theme was often, suitable data might be lacking, especially when it comes to the intersection between agriculture and health. But there are good examples like some dietary surveys, microsimulation models, some census data, local stress indicators, which we chatted about. Pauline in her presentation highlighted the detailed trade data that, for example, the FAO makes available. So there are surely data out there, but very often they are not presented in an integrated fashion where you can sort of hop on it. And maybe on that, there are some initiatives underway. For example, the food system dashboard that probably Jess Fanso has talked about already or will talk about. I forgot when when that is scheduled. But those are things. So there is clearly lots of work out there, and there's lots of work on thinking about shocks. One thing that seems to be important is being clear on the methodology. What do we mean by for example, food security, but also what do we mean by shock? What do we mean by resilience, which very much relates back to the plenary presentation, and what is really the relationship? And there we try to highlight in the input presentations that when it comes to agriculture and the food system and the interplay between shock and resilience, there are also the aspect of healthy and sustainable diets might be an important one, both as an aspect that when you take out the dietary component, that is an aspect that is very often the thing that produces the greatest health impact when we think about those shocks. But that is also the component that needs to change in the largest extent when we think about increasing resilience of the food system as it pertains to health. And I think that maybe didn't come out in the discussion so far yet, but I think having this sort of interlinkage between shocks and resilience might be an interesting angle of how to think about it further as well. Pauline, do you want to add something?
Well, no, I think you did a very good job. That was quite comprehensive. Maybe the only other issue that I wanted to add is that in our groups, we also talked about that we certainly, from a health perspective, we can't model everything, and so we need to prioritize, and perhaps more than other components within climate, agricultural, and crop modeling, health specifically is or inequalities and income, gender, etc., are very important for health modeling. And Marco, you already mentioned that rather than global, we really have a need to go down to a smaller scale, to a regional, sub-regional, national, even sub-national, with all the problems that that brings along in terms of data, etc. But what I found quite interesting, and that was the only thing that I wanted to add, is once we were discussing halfway our discussion, and he said, well, maybe, or I think, or Lewis said, what questions are we actually trying to answer, and what problems are we trying to solve with this problems? And that is maybe a key question to discuss more about, to prioritize this and see, and especially given we can't model everything, so within the boundaries of what we can, what sort of problems would we like to solve first? And maybe that helps us also a little bit in going into a certain direction and prioritization within AgMIP and the health modeling component.
Yes, thanks very much. Basically, we are already at the end of the session, so let me just add two more comments. I think all three report back showed the richness of this discussion. I think we raised definitely more questions than we provided answers, but that's a good thing because it will inspire new research. Let me throw in one additional comment from the chat. Aston Chipanchi is adding whether there's any chance to use machine learning methods to address shocks in various types of models. So this would be a topic of its own for a 2-hour session, I guess. So I think that's an interesting remark. To me, it seems that we potentially could do a great job in AgMIP to bring together these different approaches to shocks and resilience modeling, also very pragmatically to do the next steps. And I think we have raised a lot of ideas. So if the material of these sessions can be made available, then I think people have the opportunity to think more about what to make of it. So thanks very much to all the presenters and rapporteurs, and also the almost 100 participants here in this session and in the breakouts. And it was a pleasure to me. I learned a lot, and I hand back to Cynthia for few final remarks before a well-deserved break before the next sessions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Herman, for chairing this session. Thank you to all the presenters, breakout leaders, rapporteurs, and participants. I'm going to share my screen just to give everyone a heads up about the next session, which starts at noon. So let me just quickly get that up. Where it should be right here. Yes. And how do I end? Here we go. So we invite you back for another important and exciting session on reimagining the food system, nutrition diets. We bring that forward, and security, but again, across all aspects of the food system. This is many of the speakers, not all, but many of them are from our Columbia University community here in New York. And we're highlighting the initiation of the Columbia Climate School that Sir Alex Halliday spoke about at his welcome on Tuesday morning, and sharing ideas and thoughts and getting your inputs for food security, food system as one of the major themes. So please go to your program to get the link to the afternoon session, which starts right afternoon, like 12:01 or 2. So thank you very much. Thanks for the great session that's just completed.